Welcome to the Paul Street Journal. This episode is about Jubilee economics, and we're recording this episode in the tail end of 2024, and next year is the Jubilee of Hope 2025. Because the Jubilee is about economics, we're recording a video about Jubilee economics, and Brian here will be killing two birds with one stone, as he is the Jubilee's leading director for the Diocese of Paterson. And we also wanted to make a video for their sake, our diocese, learning about Jubilee and economics. So, Brian, where do we start?
I want to start with a question. How many laws are in the Old Testament?
613 laws.
All right. And St. Thomas Aquinas did something very clever for us. He categorized those 613 laws into three categories, and he uses Deuteronomy 6 to do so. So Deuteronomy 6 says there's commandments in the Bible, there's statutes, and there's judgments. And Thomas equates those to moral standards, ceremonial acts, and then judicial legislation, if you will. So which one of these, Freddy, does Jubilee fit in? Ceremonial, judicial, or moral?
I will say all of the above.
Oh, wow, that's correct. It's interesting because for the sake of the Paul Street Journal podcast, which one of these three categories does economics usually fall under? Believe it or not, it falls under the moral category more often than not, which is interesting because when we think about Catholic social teaching, we're oftentimes thinking in the moral context. Remember, we were saying that it's the liberal movement that tries to separate morality from economics, while it's Catholicism that's trying to always integrate the two. So if it's all three, what does it look like? So Jubilee is actually a set of laws. It begins with the ceremony, and that includes the blowing of the ram's horn. The Israelites, from wherever they are, they walk and they ride and they act as pilgrims, moving towards Jerusalem once the temple was built. And then they go through that liturgical ceremony, if you will, of atonement, Yom Kippur. And because of those things, judicially, they become clean, ritually clean and forgiven of sin and able to worship God in a right manner. And the results of that judicial state then ends up having economic benefits. So just like every 7 years, which we'll talk about later, at the end of every septenate, there was a year of rest for animals, for people, for the land itself. So we get that at the Jubilee year. We get the forgiveness of debts, which sounds so unrealistic these days. We get land restored. Remember, the whole idea of the Promised Land was that every Jewish family had some, and that it was passed down from generation to generation. So if any Jew had lost their land for any way, that it was given back to them every Jubilee, every 50 years. And then finally, slaves were freed. If not every 7 years, especially every 50 years.
So why exactly does all of this happen every 50 years?
Well, the Jewish society worked off of sevens. The week, the whole idea of a 7-day week, it's given to us in many ways through Middle Eastern cultures, especially the Bible. Every week ends with the Sabbath, Shabbat. So that's the week. Then there's the septenate. So this is something that we don't practice in Christianity really, but every 7 years, there was a sabbatical year where the land, the animals, the people would rest. And there was also some of these economic components as well. Then there was the Jubilee, which was every 7 times 7 years. So on the 50th year, there would be that Jubilee with the blowing of the ram's horn, the pilgrimage, the atonement, the forgiveness of sins, and all those economic benefits. The reason why that happened every 50 years was because it was all about restoring the results of the Exodus. Before the Exodus, the Israelite people were suffering from slavery for 400 years, right? They pray to God, they finally are liberated, and then when they come to the Promised Land, they're given that land. apportioned by Joshua. And the hope is that that remains. But if it doesn't, every 50 years, it's all restored, kind of starting over, restoring the Exodus. And there's more sevens. In the New Testament, in Matthew 18, when somebody asks Jesus, how many times must I forgive? What does Jesus say? 70 times 7. If you do your math, I think that's 490. So a lot of times, in other words.
Yeah.
And then in the book of Daniel, chapter 9, about 490 years before Jesus was born, somebody asks, when is the Messiah going to come? And then the angel Gabriel says, in 70 times 7 years, the Messiah will come, the anointed one will come. So we get plenty of sevens in Scripture, and Jubilee follows that.
I see. Okay, so the Jubilee and all the forgiveness and restoration and freedom that comes from it sounds awesome, ideal, almost too ideal, and almost sometimes maybe unrealistic for this to happen. So even if these Jubilee laws were pronounced on the Israelites, did they practice them? Did they happen?
I don't know, but Maimonides, the great scholar from medieval times, there's a picture of me with him in Cordoba.
In Birkenstocks.
Yes. So he makes the claim that the whole counting of the 50 years of Jubilee started 64 years after entry into the Promised Land, because they needed time to like set up shop. Then there were 17 Jubilees over the course of 850 years that were counted and practiced according to Scripture. Then, around the year 587, the first temple was destroyed by the Babylonians. Then there was the many years of exile. Then they came back, finally were able to rebuild that second temple. And by the time that temple was built, they would continue again to count the Jubilees and to celebrate, but the economic laws were not practiced anymore. So there was no more land given back to people. It led to a lot of landlessness, to the point where Joseph and Mary didn't have land, and Joseph had to work as a day laborer, as a tekton, working on a daily basis, probably getting paid on a daily basis.
Okay, so tracing the Jubilee's presence in the Israelite history, what role did the Jubilee play in the Israelites being what God calls a light to the nations?
Yeah, that's a good question. A lot of people who are in evangelization will think about Israel as a reserved remnant of people who are moving towards holiness with God. And it's the role of the Israelite people and the Jews to be a light to the nations, to bring the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob to the whole world. Jubilee is not a part of that in the Old Testament. Jubilee is about getting right as a nation, as the nation of Israel, themselves first, before they go out and become a light to the nations. So it's all about a national, inward-looking kind of economic practice where they get right themselves first, then they become a light to the nations. Both Jesus' statement, which we're about to read from Isaiah, and the light to the nations, they're both part of Isaiah, different components though. So let's go to Jesus now.
So you mentioned Jesus. What role does Jubilee play in Jesus' ministry?
So Jesus begins his ministry when he returns to his hometown, this time as a prophet to Nazareth. He goes to the synagogue, he opens the scroll, and he reads from Isaiah. And this is what he says.
The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim liberty to the captives and recovering of sight to the blind, to set at liberty those who are oppressed, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor.
All right, so we see Daniel 9 in there, right? The 70 times 7, 490 years is when the anointed one or the Messiah or the Christ will come. And there we see that he is anointed, right? To proclaim good news to the poor, right? So is Jubilee just blanket, like raw, total, comprehensive evangelization? No, it's the component of evangelization that is for the poor, the oppressed, the prisoners, right? Those who are afflicted, even medically. So it's not a broad celebration that's periodic, like every 50 years or every 25 years. It's the liberation component of the gospel, not the totality of it, just the liberation component of it.
So in reading this fulfillment of the Jubilee from Jesus, who benefits? Who is the benefactor of Jesus's fulfillment of the Jubilee?
Yeah, it's a good question. So Jesus was Jewish, correct?
Yes.
And he understood the Old Testament context of Jubilee, which was the nation looking inwardly so that it could be evangelizing the world outwardly. Jesus knows also that even from his own family experience, that Jubilee was not being practiced in the Second Temple era, the temple that Jesus lived in. So none of those economic benefits that Jubilee calls for were happening. It seems to me, based off of his choice of readings here, when he begins his mission, is that he's going to single-handedly, at least for a time, single-handedly take on the role of fulfilling Jubilee. And not only that, but he spends 3 years training 12 disciples. They become apostles, people who then will spread this to all nations. And it seems to me also that he's telling them to bring this message of good news to all nations, right? So we're talking a global Jubilee, perpetual Jubilee. So what was once this inward-looking thing is now also outward and global and universal, which is what Catholic means.
Yeah. So this, I mean, with all that said, this component of Jesus's ministry to do all that for the whole world, it seems very economic. It's related very much to economics.
Yes. And Catholic social teaching is primarily about economics. Of course, there's many other components, but Catholic social teaching is very much the fulfillment of Jubilee.
So understanding Jubilee as initially something for the Israelites to look inward to then go out, and then Jesus coming to fulfill that for the sake of bringing his Jubilee to the whole world, I think it reminds us a bit of what Pope John the 23rd said in Mater et Magistra when he called for the development of apostles, and not just the clergy and the successors of the apostles, but lay apostles.
Lay Catholic social teaching apostles.
Yeah, exactly. To go out into the world and to promote Catholic social teaching wherever they can for the sake of doing what Jesus calls for in his fulfillment of the Jubilee. And as we've mentioned, there's many principles involved in that, the Catholic social teaching principles, which we've talked about throughout the entire Paul Street Journal, which are perhaps different from the time of the Israelites or from Jesus's time, but certainly still related to the concept of looking inward to then go out and fulfilling this Jubilee.
What is the Catholic social teaching lay apostle specifically promoting? More people owning their land, more people owning their house, owning ideally their own means of production, living in a stable household, locational stability, favoring small businesses, and helping workers, right? This is the same subject as Jubilee economics, right? But now it's just broadly distributed among all people.
Yeah. I mean, the thread is clear from what the Israelites received in those years of Jubilee to what the Catholic social teaching of today calls for. So, speaking of today, why do we also celebrate Jubilee years every 25 years?
Well, apparently every 50 years wasn't enough. I think that starting in the medieval period, it became every 25 years. I think life expectancy went down, and everybody wanted to celebrate a Jubilee in their lifetime. And remember, there's more than just economic components of Jubilee. There's the forgiveness of sins, there's the indulgences, all these things that people wanted access to. So I think that's why it happened more often. But honestly, Jubilee economics, if we're apostles of Catholic social teaching, this is an everyday thing. It's not something that we're waiting every 25 years for. It's something that we're doing all the time. Of course, it's something that we celebrate in a special way every 25 years now.
So, I mean, although you say it is an everyday thing, the Jubilee of Hope is coming up next year, 2025? What do we do to fulfill the Jubilee ourselves, especially next year that we are celebrating it?
Well, there's too much to do. And each person, based off of where they are going to be able to take part in different components of the Jubilee. But what I would recommend for the sake of the Paul Street Journal podcast is educate yourself on Catholic social teaching. If you haven't watched the episodes of this, watch them. If you want to go deeper than that, read the encyclicals on Catholic social teaching. Try to make the Jubilee a true enactment of the original purpose of Jubilee, which is pilgrimage, forgiveness of sins, go to confession, receive those indulgences. Try to help somebody out. Try to, if you have the ability to help somebody obtain their land or their means of production, or to help an immigrant, or to at least educate people on these matters, that would be a true, authentic fulfillment of Jubilee.
Awesome. Thank you. I hope that those are encouraging words, and I hope that they encourage our audience. Looking forward to the year of Jubilee, Jubilee of Hope 2025. And I hope this video proves useful for them. So thank you, Brian, and thank you all for joining us for the Paul Street Journal. See you next time.